There exists a dangerous delusion in our age, the belief that one can accumulate knowledge without transforming one's character. I have witnessed countless scholars whose minds grew sharp while their souls remained stunted, whose learning became a tower of Babel rather than a ladder to wisdom. This is not education, it is intellectual gluttony. In my years forming minds at the École Pratique de Hautes Études, I discovered what the ancients knew but moderns forget: knowledge without virtue is not learning but corruption. The intellect, you see, is not a storage facility for facts but a living faculty that shapes the entire person. When we feed it truth, we must simultaneously cultivate the character capable of bearing that truth. The American academic world, with its emphasis on specialization and technique, has forgotten this fundamental principle. We produce experts who lack wisdom, researchers who cannot live well, scholars who master their subjects but remain strangers to themselves. This fragmentation is not progress, it is regression to a pre-Christian understanding of learning. Today, I wish to share with you what I call the Sertillanges principle, that authentic intellectual growth demands proportional moral and spiritual development. This is not mere theory but the practical wisdom of centuries of Dominican formation. When character grows with knowledge, we become not just learned but wise. When it does not, we become learned fools, perhaps the most dangerous creatures in any civilization. Chapter 1: The Unity of Mind and Heart in Dominican Tradition. The Dominican charism rests upon a profound insight that our secular age has abandoned. The intellect and the will are not separate faculties operating in isolation, but intimately connected powers of a unified soul. When we think, we simultaneously choose. When we know, we necessarily love or reject what we encounter. This is why St. Thomas Aquinas, our great doctor, insisted that all knowledge tends toward action, all contemplation toward love. In my decades of teaching, I have observed that students who attempt to compartmentalize their intellectual life from their moral development inevitably suffer from what I term cognitive disintegration. They master theories of justice while practicing selfishness. They study the nature of truth while living in deception. They analyze virtue while remaining vicious. This is not learning, it is a form of spiritual schizophrenia that renders both their knowledge and their character defective. The Dominican approach recognizes that the mind naturally seeks truth, but truth is not merely abstract information, it is reality itself, which includes moral reality. When we truly understand justice, we cannot remain unjust. When we genuinely comprehend temperance, we are called to practice moderation. When we deeply grasp the nature of courage, cowardice becomes repugnant to us. This is why true education necessarily involves conversion, the turning of the whole person toward reality. Consider how this works practically. When I teach a student to read carefully, I am simultaneously forming habits of attention, patience, and humility before the text. When I guide someone in the art of reasoning, I cultivate intellectual honesty, precision, and the courage to follow arguments where they lead. When I demonstrate the discipline of sustained study, I am fostering perseverance, self-control, and reverence for truth. The modern separation of intellectual training from character formation produces graduates who are technically competent but morally immature. They possess powerful tools but lack the wisdom to use them well. They can analyze but cannot discern. They can critique but cannot create. They can deconstruct but cannot build. This is why so much contemporary scholarship, despite its technical sophistication, leaves us feeling empty and confused rather than enlightened and edified. The Dominican way insists that every act of genuine learning must simultaneously strengthen the intellectual virtues, those habits of mind that enable us to think well, and the moral virtues that enable us to live well. These are not separate processes but aspects of a single development, the growth of a human person toward full maturity in truth and goodness. Chapter 2: Why knowledge without virtue becomes dangerous. History provides us with sobering examples of what happens when intellectual development proceeds without corresponding moral growth. The 20th century, despite unprecedented advances in science and scholarship, witnessed horrors that surpassed those of any previous age. How is this possible? Because knowledge, when divorced from virtue, becomes a weapon in the hands of the morally immature. I have observed this principle operating at every level of intellectual life. The student who masters critical methods but lacks humility becomes a cynic who destroys without building. The scholar who develops analytical skills but remains proud becomes an intellectual tyrant who uses knowledge to dominate rather than serve. The researcher who accumulates expertise but lacks prudence becomes a danger to himself and others, applying powerful techniques without wisdom about their proper use. This is not an accident but an inevitable consequence of how the human mind works. Knowledge naturally tends to expand our power to understand, to manipulate, to influence, to control. But power without virtue is tyranny, whether exercised over ideas, people, or circumstances. The intellectually powerful person who lacks corresponding moral development becomes like a child with a loaded weapon, capable of tremendous harm despite the best intentions. Consider the contemporary university, with its emphasis on specialization and technical competence. We train students to become experts in narrow fields without ensuring they develop the wisdom to understand how their expertise relates to human flourishing. We produce environmental scientists who understand ecosystems but live wastefully, political theorists who analyze justice but practice favoritism, psychologists who study human nature but cannot govern their own emotions, economists who model markets but remain enslaved to greed. This fragmentation reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of what knowledge is and what it is for. Knowledge is not a collection of neutral tools that can be used indifferently for good or evil. Knowledge is participation in truth, and truth has an inherent moral dimension. To know the good is to be called to do it. To understand beauty is to be obligated to protect it. To grasp truth is to be responsible for living in accordance with it. The ancient Greeks understood this connection, which is why Socrates insisted that knowledge and virtue are inseparable. No one does wrong willingly, he claimed, because to truly know the good is to be drawn to it. The medievals preserved this insight in their understanding of the convertibility of truth, goodness, and beauty. But modernity has forgotten this wisdom, creating a false separation between fact and value, knowledge and virtue, understanding and obligation. The result is a civilization that possesses unprecedented technical power but lacks the moral wisdom to use it well. We can split atoms but cannot unite communities. We can decode genomes but cannot develop character. We can connect globally but cannot love locally. We have gained the world of information but lost the wisdom of formation. Chapter 3: The Intellectual Virtues as Foundation of Character. The tradition of intellectual virtue, stretching from Aristotle through Aquinas to our own time, recognizes that good thinking requires good character, and good character supports good thinking. This is not a mere philosophical theory but a practical necessity for anyone who would live an authentic intellectual life. Consider the virtue of intellectual humility. The proud student cannot learn because he assumes he already knows. He approaches texts to confirm his prejudices rather than to discover truth. He engages with opponents to defeat them rather than to understand them. He studies to display his cleverness rather than to grow in wisdom. Such a person may accumulate information and develop techniques, but he cannot achieve genuine understanding because his pride creates a barrier between himself and reality. Contrast this with the humble student who approaches each text, each argument, each conversation with the recognition that he may be wrong, that others may see what he has missed, that truth is larger than his current grasp of it. Such humility is not weakness but strength, the strength to change one's mind when confronted with better reasons, to admit ignorance when faced with mystery, to learn from anyone who can teach. Or consider intellectual courage, the willingness to pursue truth wherever it leads, even when it contradicts our preferences or threatens our interests. How many scholars compromise their research to serve political agendas? How many students avoid difficult questions because they fear the answers? How many intellectuals silence themselves rather than risk unpopularity? Without courage, the intellectual life becomes a form of cowardice, hiding behind the safety of accepted opinions rather than venturing into the dangerous territory of genuine inquiry. Intellectual honesty requires us to represent opposing views fairly, to acknowledge the strength of objections to our positions, to admit the limitations of our evidence, to distinguish between what we know and what we merely suspect. This virtue stands opposed to the sophistry that characterizes so much contemporary discourse, the art of making the weaker argument appear stronger through rhetorical manipulation rather than genuine reasoning. Perseverance enables us to sustain the long effort required for deep understanding. Most intellectual problems cannot be solved in a single session of thinking. They require patient, sustained attention over months or years. Without the virtue of perseverance, we remain intellectual dilettantes, sampling ideas without ever fully digesting them, beginning projects without completing them, developing interests without pursuing them to their proper conclusions. Intellectual justice requires us to give each idea its due consideration, neither dismissing valuable insights because of their source nor accepting weak arguments because we find them attractive. This virtue guards against both prejudice and wishful thinking, ensuring that our judgments are based on the merits of the case rather than on irrelevant factors. These intellectual virtues are not separate from moral virtues but specific applications of moral excellence to the life of the mind. The humble person is humble in thinking as well as acting. The courageous person pursues truth as well as right action. The honest person speaks and thinks truthfully. The just person is fair in reasoning as well as in dealing with others. When these virtues are cultivated together, they create what we might call intellectual character, a stable disposition to think well that supports and is supported by the disposition to live well. This is why the great masters of our tradition insisted that the highest form of education is not merely the transmission of information or even the development of skills, but the formation of persons capable of wisdom. Chapter 4: The Practical Discipline of Simultaneous Development. The integration of intellectual and moral development cannot be left to chance or good intentions. It requires specific practices and disciplines that ensure both dimensions of human formation proceed together. In my experience forming serious students, I have discovered that this integration happens not through abstract theorizing but through concrete habits that unite mind and heart in daily practice. Begin with the fundamental discipline of reading. Most students approach texts as consumers, extracting information for their own purposes without entering into genuine dialogue with the author. This consumerist approach breeds intellectual selfishness and stunts both understanding and character. Instead, approach each text as an encounter with another mind, seeking first to understand before seeking to evaluate. This requires the moral virtue of patience, allowing the author to develop his argument fully before rushing to judgment. It demands humility, recognizing that this person may know something you do not. It calls for justice, giving the argument a fair hearing regardless of your initial reaction. When you practice this kind of reading consistently, something remarkable happens. You simultaneously develop better comprehension skills and greater moral sensitivity. You become more capable of understanding complex arguments and more disposed to treat other people with fairness and respect. The intellectual and moral dimensions of growth reinforce each other naturally. Consider the discipline of writing. Most students write to display what they know rather than to discover what they think. This performative approach encourages intellectual vanity and produces prose that impresses rather than illuminates. Instead, write to clarify your own thinking, to work through problems, to engage genuinely with questions that matter. This requires intellectual honesty, admitting when you are confused rather than pretending to understand. It demands courage, pursuing difficult questions rather than settling for easy answers. It calls for perseverance, revising and refining until your thoughts achieve clarity. When you write in this spirit, you develop both better prose and better character. You become more capable of clear expression and more committed to truthfulness. You learn to value substance over appearance, depth over display, service to truth over service to ego. The practice of discussion and debate offers another opportunity for integrated development. Most academic discourse today is competitive rather than collaborative. Participants seek to win rather than to learn. This adversarial approach corrupts both thinking and character, producing clever arguers who care more about victory than truth. Instead, engage in conversation as a shared search for understanding. Listen not just to find weaknesses in opposing views but to discover strengths you may have overlooked. Argue not to defeat but to clarify. Question not to embarrass but to deepen understanding. This collaborative approach to intellectual exchange requires nearly every virtue: humility to learn from others, courage to change your mind, patience to work through difficulties, justice to represent opposing views fairly, temperance to speak when speaking helps and remain silent when silence serves better. As these virtues are exercised in intellectual contexts, they strengthen and become more available in all other areas of life. The discipline of contemplative study, the practice of moving beyond analysis to synthesis, beyond comprehension to wisdom, requires perhaps the greatest integration of intellectual and moral development. To contemplate is to rest in truth, to allow reality to shape us rather than constantly trying to manipulate it for our own purposes. This requires a fundamental reorientation from having to being, from grasping to receiving, from controlling to surrendering. Such contemplation cannot be achieved through technique alone but requires the purification of desire, the ordering of loves, the integration of all our powers in service of what is highest and best. Chapter 5: The Danger of Intellectual Pride and Its Remedies. Of all the obstacles to integrated intellectual development, none is more deadly than pride, the desire to be recognized as superior, to possess knowledge as private property, to use learning as a weapon for establishing dominance over others. Pride corrupts the intellectual life at its source because it substitutes the self for truth as the ultimate object of concern. The proud scholar does not seek truth, he seeks to appear wise. He does not pursue understanding, he pursues recognition. I have observed how pride manifests in intellectual contexts throughout my years of teaching. The proud student cannot admit ignorance, so he pretends to understand what he does not. He cannot acknowledge error, so he defends positions long after they have been refuted. He cannot learn from inferiors, so he dismisses insights that come from unexpected sources. He cannot collaborate genuinely, so he turns every discussion into a competition. Most tragically, he cannot grow because growth requires admitting that one's current state is inadequate. This intellectual pride is particularly dangerous because it often masquerades as virtue. The proud scholar claims to be defending truth when he is actually defending his reputation. He claims to be maintaining standards when he is actually protecting his position. He claims to be serving the common good when he is actually serving his own ego. This self-deception makes intellectual pride more difficult to recognize and root out than other forms of pride. The remedy begins with a proper understanding of what knowledge is and where it comes from. All truth originates in God, who is truth itself. When we know anything truly, we participate in divine knowledge. This participation is a gift, not an achievement. We do not create truth, we discover it. We do not own truth, we serve it. We do not use truth, truth uses us, transforming us into more truthful beings when we receive it properly. This understanding naturally produces intellectual humility. If all knowledge is gift, then there is no ground for boasting. If truth is larger than any individual mind, then there is always more to learn. If knowledge is meant to be shared, then hoarding it violates its essential nature. If truth serves human flourishing, then using it for selfish purposes corrupts its meaning. Practical exercises can help cultivate this humility. Regularly confess your intellectual limitations. Admit when you do not understand something rather than pretending knowledge you lack. Actively seek out people who disagree with you and listen to them carefully, looking for ways they might be right rather than ways they are wrong. Study subjects outside your expertise, experiencing again the discomfort of being a beginner. Teach others, which quickly reveals the gaps in your own understanding. Another powerful remedy for intellectual pride is the practice of intellectual charity, the commitment to help others grow in understanding even when this does not benefit you directly. When you genuinely desire the intellectual good of others, you cannot use your knowledge as a weapon against them. When you truly serve truth rather than self, you find joy in others' discoveries even when they surpass your own. The contemplative dimension of intellectual life provides the deepest remedy for pride. In contemplation, we experience truth not as something we possess but as something that possesses us. We discover that reality is infinitely larger and more beautiful than we imagined, that our role is not to master it but to be mastered by it. This experience naturally produces the humility that pride destroys and the wonder that makes genuine learning possible. The saints understood this principle perfectly. Despite their extraordinary learning, they remained profoundly humble because they experienced their knowledge as participation in divine wisdom rather than personal achievement. They saw themselves as servants of truth rather than its masters, stewards of gifts rather than owners of possessions. This humility did not diminish their intellectual authority but established it on a secure foundation. Chapter 6: Forming Students in Integrated Excellence. The teacher who would form students in integrated intellectual and moral excellence must understand that formation is quite different from mere instruction. Instruction transmits information and develops skills. Formation shapes persons, cultivating not just competence but character, not just knowledge but wisdom. This requires a fundamentally different approach to education than what dominates most contemporary institutions. Formation begins with the recognition that students are not empty vessels to be filled with content but living souls to be awakened to truth. Each student brings a unique constellation of gifts, limitations, experiences, and aspirations. The wise teacher learns to read these differences and adapt his approach accordingly, like a gardener who understands that different plants require different conditions to flourish. The formative teacher must model what he seeks to cultivate. Students learn more from what we are than from what we say. If we want them to approach learning with humility, we must demonstrate intellectual humility ourselves. If we want them to pursue truth courageously, we must show courage in our own thinking. If we want them to integrate knowledge with virtue, we must embody that integration in our own lives. This modeling cannot be artificial or performative. Students have an uncanny ability to detect inauthenticity. They know when we are playing a role rather than living from conviction. They sense when our teaching comes from genuine love of truth and students versus when it comes from ego or ambition. Only when our formation of them flows from our own genuine pursuit of integrated excellence will it bear lasting fruit. The content and methods we choose must serve formative purposes. This means selecting texts not just for their information value but for their capacity to form character. The great books of our tradition, the works of Plato and Aristotle, Augustine and Aquinas, Dante and Shakespeare, endure not merely because they contain important ideas but because engaging with them seriously changes the reader. They present models of integrated living, characters who embody or struggle with virtue, arguments that demand not just intellectual assent but personal response. Our methods must engage the whole person, not just the analytical intelligence. This means using approaches that require moral as well as intellectual virtues, collaborative discussions that demand patience and charity, research projects that require honesty and perseverance, writing assignments that call for courage and humility, contemplative exercises that integrate understanding with wisdom. Assessment becomes particularly important in formative education. Traditional testing often rewards cleverness over wisdom, competitiveness over collaboration, performance over genuine understanding. Formative assessment must evaluate not just what students know but how they think, not just their conclusions but their reasoning processes, not just their individual achievements but their contribution to the learning community. The learning environment itself must support integrated development. This means creating spaces that are conducive to serious conversation, contemplative reflection, and collaborative inquiry. It means establishing rhythms that balance intensive work with restorative leisure, intellectual challenge with emotional support, individual study with community dialogue. Perhaps most importantly, formative education must help students discover their unique intellectual vocation, the particular way each is called to serve truth and the common good through the life of the mind. Not everyone is called to be a professional scholar, but everyone is called to think well about the questions that matter in their particular circumstances. The teacher's role is to help each student identify and prepare for this calling. This requires moving beyond the one-size-fits-all approach that dominates mass education. It means taking time to know students individually, understanding their gifts and struggles, their interests and concerns, their backgrounds and aspirations. It means helping them see connections between their studies and their lives, between abstract principles and concrete decisions, between academic learning and personal formation. The ultimate goal is to produce graduates who are not just knowledgeable but wise, not just skilled but virtuous, not just successful but flourishing. Such persons will serve their communities well regardless of their particular professions because they have learned to integrate excellence of mind with excellence of character. Chapter 7: The Fruits of Integrated Intellectual Life. When intellectual development proceeds hand in hand with moral and spiritual growth, it produces fruits that far surpass what either dimension could achieve in isolation. The person who has learned to unite knowledge with virtue, understanding with character, becomes capable of contributions to human flourishing that neither the merely clever nor the merely good can make. The first fruit is wisdom, the ability to see reality as it truly is and to order one's life accordingly. Wisdom differs from mere knowledge as maturity differs from precocity. The knowledgeable person possesses information, the wise person understands what that information means for living well. Knowledge knows facts, wisdom grasps their significance. Knowledge accumulates data, wisdom discerns patterns that reveal deeper truths about reality. This wisdom manifests in practical judgment, the ability to make good decisions in concrete circumstances where abstract principles must be applied with sensitivity to context. The person formed in integrated excellence develops what we might call prudential intelligence, the capacity to read situations accurately, anticipate consequences realistically, and choose actions that serve genuine human goods rather than mere preferences. Such persons become natural leaders not because they seek power but because others recognize their reliability, their soundness of judgment, their commitment to what is truly good. Their authority rests not on position or force but on the evident integration of their character and competence. People trust them because they have learned to trust reality over appearance, substance over style, service over self-interest. Another fruit is what I call contemplative creativity, the ability to generate genuine insights and solutions because one's mind has been purified of the distractions that prevent most people from seeing clearly. When the intellect is properly ordered by virtue, when desires are disciplined by right reason, when attention is focused by contemplative practice, the mind becomes capable of penetrating to the heart of problems and discovering solutions that escape those who rely on technique alone. This creativity is not the restless innovation that characterizes so much contemporary culture, the compulsive need to be original regardless of whether originality serves truth. Rather, it is the fresh perception that comes from seeing familiar realities with eyes cleansed by virtue and disciplined by study. Such persons often seem to rediscover ancient truths, but their rediscovery breathes new life into timeless wisdom. The integrated intellectual also develops exceptional resilience in the face of intellectual and cultural challenges. Because their convictions rest on deep understanding rather than mere opinion, because their character supports their thinking rather than undermining it, they can engage with opposing views without fear, examine their own beliefs critically without losing confidence, and adapt to changing circumstances without abandoning fundamental principles. This resilience enables them to serve as bridges in polarized communities, helping others find common ground without compromising essential truths. They can speak to diverse audiences because they understand both the universal human concerns that unite us and the particular perspectives that divide us. They can critique without destroying, reform without revolutionizing, progress without abandoning what is valuable from the past. Perhaps most importantly, the person formed in integrated excellence experiences deep satisfaction and joy in the intellectual life itself. Learning becomes not a burden to be endured or a competition to be won, but a participation in the divine life of truth, goodness, and beauty. Study becomes a form of worship, teaching becomes a form of service, thinking becomes a form of prayer. This joy is contagious. Students recognize the difference between teachers who have found genuine fulfillment in the intellectual life and those who are merely performing their professional roles. The former inspire others to pursue excellence not for external rewards but for the intrinsic satisfaction of participating in truth. They create communities of learners rather than collections of competitors. The ultimate fruit is the capacity to hand on this integrated approach to future generations. Those who have experienced the unity of intellectual and moral development naturally seek to cultivate the same integration in others. They become not just practitioners but teachers of wisdom, not just learners but formators of character, not just individuals pursuing excellence but members of a tradition dedicated to human flourishing. In this way, the Sertillanges principle perpetuates itself across generations, creating lineages of wisdom that serve as light in dark times, sources of renewal when communities lose their way, and reservoirs of human excellence that can be drawn upon whenever the need arises. Conclusion. The path I have described, the simultaneous cultivation of intellectual excellence and moral virtue, is not an optional enhancement to education but its essential nature. When we separate mind from heart, knowledge from character, learning from living, we create not educated persons but sophisticated barbarians, clever fools who possess the tools of civilization but lack the wisdom to use them well. The Dominican tradition offers a proven alternative, an approach to intellectual life that recognizes the fundamental unity of human nature and the necessary integration of all our powers in service of truth. This is not mere theory but practical wisdom tested by centuries of experience in forming minds and hearts capable of serving both God and humanity. In our current age of information abundance and wisdom scarcity, of technical sophistication and moral confusion, of global connectivity and spiritual fragmentation, this integrated approach becomes not just valuable but necessary for survival. We cannot continue producing graduates who know much but understand little, who can analyze but cannot discern, who can critique but cannot create. The choice before every student, teacher, and educational institution is clear: will we continue the fragmented approach that produces learned incompetence, or will we embrace learned incompetence, or will we embrace learned incompetence, or will we embrace